areas in eDiscovery and related areas.
Welcome to eDiscovery Leaders Live, hosted by ACEDS and sponsored by Reveal. I am George Socha, Senior Vice President of Brand Awareness at Reveal. Each Friday morning at 11 a.m. Eastern, I host an episode of eDiscovery Leaders Live where I get the chance to chat with luminaries in eDiscovery and related areas. Past episodes are available on the Reveal website. Go to revealdata.com, select Resources, then select eDiscovery Leaders Live. My guest this week is Lauren Roso. Lauren is a solutions advisor at ProSearch. She previously spent time at Moray, Beacon Hill Staffing, Legal Support, and the U.S. Army Center for Health Promotion and Preventative Medicine. She has a JD from the University of Pittsburgh School of Law and a BA from the University of Maryland. Lauren, welcome.
Hi, George. How are you?
Okay, glad you could join us this week.
Thanks for having me.
Oh, so this week, as I mentioned in my note this morning that I sent out, we're looking at the people side of what we do. We'll leave the technical discussion for others. Today is people. Where would you like to start with that?
I think there's a lot of different places that you could start, since people, when we talk about people, it covers a vast array of kind of topics. But I think one of the biggest things is looking at how the discovery industry has changed and what that means for, what the role of service providers kind of has become, and what it's evolving into and what kind of makes service providers stand out. I think we've seen a fairly big shift in the last couple of years, where, and I'm pretty new to the industry, well, not new, about 10 years, but, I don't have the record that some people do back at the paper boxes, but I feel like, until the last couple of years, things were kind of steady, search terms, slow adoption of TAR, everything was kind of mapped out in terms of how we might approach data types for email. Providers made money off of hosting and processing. All of that is shifting. So kind of, the way that costs are allocated, what things are billed for is very much changing. And also what clients, corporations and law firms is looking for out of their service provider is very different.
So with that shift, and it's been a rapid shift over the last few years compared to what we had been doing for a while, what has been the impact for the people who are delivering eDiscovery capabilities?
So I think it's put an importance on critical thinking. So I think one of the big things that shifted is there's not always, it's less often, or it's not always consistent that you see a set way. Say, hey, we have a set of search terms, we're going to go down this road. More often it's, hey, how do I start this? This is the data set. What am I doing? Here's our goals for this situation. How do we attack it? And that's not only attacking it from a technology perspective. What are we going to use to work with this data type? What are we going to use to process this novel type of data? How are we going to find this information faster? But it's also, what's the goal of the review and how much breadth do you have as an organization looking at that? So it really, I think, requires a lot of critical thinking on the part of the service provider to truly be a partner and an advocate and not just kind of a task taker and checking the boxes and making sure that all the requests that, used to be pretty standard are really evolving into more kind of how can I help the client instead of just how can I execute this task for the client.
I think that for a number of years, there was, at least among certain providers and certain consumers, a desire to move to a more uniform and standardized approach where you knew exactly what needed to be done. As you said, you could check the boxes and move along. It sounds like that is changing, which means a changing dynamic as well between the consumer side of things, whether you're as a service provider, whether you're working with a law firm or corporation or a governmental body, and then the people at the service provider. So you're no longer, as you said, order takers. You're now critical thinkers. Describe how that process might work in a project.
I think it's looking at it from, one of my favorite words people laugh at is holistic. And the first time I heard someone use it, I was like, well, that just sounds silly. But it's really looking at it from all angles and taking into the factors of where does this case sit? Where does this case sit in terms of the stature of the case? What type of case is it? Is an investigation, which we normally ask all of those questions anyway. But also looking at it from the view of the client. What is their goal here? Is it an internal investigation that we need to find as fast as possible? Does that mean we need to have a complete, set trail of terms, or do we have a lot of flexibility in how to do that? And really, if the client's not sure what they're looking for, filling in those gaps, taking those factors of what the data type is, what they're looking for from a substance matter, and really taking all of those things into consideration when creating a plan. It's really kind of helping them fill in the gaps and lead them where they're not sure where they need to go, but they don't realize they might need to go.
So if I can use probably a poor analogy here, I think of how houses are built these days. And you have essentially one of three options. One is the house is built and you move in. The second is that you have what I think of as a plan A, plan B, plan C model. You've got a few choices to make, but it is the dining room on this side versus that side. What does the siding look like? Most of the decisions are largely made, and as a purchase, as someone is saying, build the house for me, you have limited choices. And then there's the bespoke model where you sit down with an architect, design build firm, something like that, and it really is from the beginning on. What do we want? What should it look like? How should it be constructed? Where do you see you and ProSearch fitting in? Option A, door 1, door 2, or door 3?
Well, option A, I think, is going to always be there in some capacity. There are always going to be cases that are still, negotiated using search terms or a set amount of things. Those are always going to be there, and that execution always has to be correct, the steps in that process. But I think we are, definitely seeing a shift not only towards B, because now we have a multitude of tools to work with, of course, everything within relativity, Brainspace. There are options to kind of, choose your approach. But what we're also seeing is, C, we have this new data type. How do we deal with it? Do we even have technology to deal with it? How do we review that? Because, as we've all discussed, reviewing a chat can be very different than reviewing an email. And what if we start getting other things? Thinking about that end user experience, whether it's the contract attorney, whether it's the associate at the law firm, thinking about all of those things to kind of customize a plan. Again, working off all of the foundational tools from A and B, but it's not necessarily cookie cutter that you can put into a sequence that you can do press, rinse, and repeat all the time. Because again, especially as I think another factor that comes into play here is the changing dynamic within corporate law departments and law firms, and the switch, while there's more concerns of privacy and information governance, as all of those factors start to come into discovery where they may have been more separated before. As a service provider, we have to think of how those, the decisions that we're doing can also, impact our clients and potentially help them.
On that front, that changing dynamic, let's start with law firms. And what does the changing dynamic look like as a practical matter when you're working with a law firm on a matter or set of matters?
So I think law firm, I will say from my experience, is a little bit harder to handle. I definitely have a lot more experience with corporate legal departments. But I think a law firm, there's a lot of diversity in terms of how quickly law firms are changing. I think that there are some that are ready to move forward, want to reduce costs of, document review, looking for ways of how we can completely eliminate that on some fronts, while others nope, we just need to get to a number, review that number if that's what we feel defensible. So I think I think they're going to find that things are changing as well, because what they're being asked to do from the corporations is going to also be different, and that's going to affect everyone down the line.
So let's turn then to corporations, where you do have more experience. And how do you see that dynamic changing? How has it changed over, for example, the last decade?
So I think that there's more where discovery or, the discovery legal department might have been a little bit separate. Now we're seeing, potentially working with other departments or bleeding more into information governance, trying to kind of, since all of the information in one way or another is connected for the corporation, to kind of maybe take away those barriers where before. So other parties may now be interested in where, how those documents are handled, how those documents are produced from a privacy perspective, from an information perspective, worried about, potential exposure, because of, what they're giving out, more ownership of the data is, I guess I would call it, from the corporate side, instead of thinking of like, oh, the documents take from our house, to the legal side, and then they're dealt with for litigation. I think the importance of privacy is making a shift to making more persons interested in their data, and seeing, maybe this isn't the right phrase, but how valuable it really is and how much they want to make sure that they're tracking the data through every step of the process.
That suggests, if I'm interpreting this correctly, that unlike often in the past where someone at a service provider would operate primarily at the direction of a law firm, you're dealing much more directly with the corporate legal departments, which I think has been one of ProSearch's hallmarks. But also, not only are you dealing directly with people at the corporation, it sounds like you're dealing with a wider range of people, not just an attorney in the legal department who's got to make sure that discovery happens on budget, on time, things like that. But it sounds like with information governance, data privacy, and any of a number of other people as well. Is that right?
Yes. So I would say that's definitely a hallmark of ProSearch. It's also some experience that I had, in my previous life. But yeah, it's the legal department isn't necessarily, they don't operate within themselves. They obviously work with the business units and privacy and security and all the other people that kind of, impact or have an impact on their organization. So there's a lot of key stakeholders that sometimes us as the service provider doesn't see, but there are considerations. And that's really kind of what makes service providers stand out, is that ability to see all the moving pieces and see how, the work that you're doing may not only help your direct client, but then how that sets them up for success within their own business unit.
It sounds then as if that also means that on the provider side, you need a wider range of people available to work with clients. It isn't sufficient just to have someone who can process data, for example.
Yes. So there's definitely, we obviously need the specialists who process data, who can dig into things. There is definitely a place for specialists, but I think we're also seeing a little bit of a rise of the generalist, someone who can, do a lot of different tasks, manage a lot of different personalities, kind of be able to cover a different range of things and not just, pigeonholed into one specific task. And I think that COVID has really kind of, accelerated that. And I've been on some discussions in the industry where I've heard similar that, people that are adaptable and kind of able to cover a broad range of things, that because the skill set being demanded is a bit more different.
So an ability to look at things holistically, a broad base of experience and expertise, the ability to think critically. I mean, as a side note, you're talking about a broad liberal arts undergraduate education, of which I'm a strong proponent. But more to the point in this discussion, it sounds like there is a set of skills that is becoming more important. What does it include beside the things that I just mentioned?
The other thing that I think it includes, and your guest Kevin mentioned this last week, is the ability to communicate. And I think that is incredibly important. The ability to not only, work with what the data set that you're working on, work with the problem that you're working on, but able to communicate effectively why you're taking the steps that you're taking, why we're using the approach that we're doing, how the technology works. Because again, the job as a service provider doesn't stop when we've, done that task or created the workflow or executed the project, because then either that attorney or that in-house counsel has to take that foundation and move forward with it. And really seeing the entire life cycle of what we do, you're creating that foundation of, here's how we search this, here's how we came upon this, here's everything you need to know in order to defend this. That ability to communicate all of those things effectively and in a way that they understand, I think is increasingly critical.
This more holistic approach, which sounds like, and I think it does have a lot of advantages, may not be necessarily the one that someone in a corporate legal department is used to dealing with, especially in the context of working with an eDiscovery provider. What sort of challenges have you run up against, and then how do you deal with them?
It's definitely a bit of a shift from, how I say, typical discovery was or for the last couple of years, but I think it's a good shift. I think the hardest part is it's not always tangible. So, when we have a set of search terms, or that we're going to do, okay, we're doing search terms, we're going to do a TAR model until we get to this position and this recall. All of those are very tangible items. When you kind of say, well, we're going to do a set of, search terms, we're going to look at some hot documents, we're going to find, X, Y, and Z, and then we're going to maybe apply a portable model over here and see what comes out. A lot of those things are, it's just not comfortable. But also just, so getting through that communication of here's how we're going to do this, and then walking through the steps of why, again, that communication aspect. And I think you have to really show that they can trust you by giving guidance and by not always, so one, by finding solutions, but also putting up the right parameters for requests. Say, no, we actually can't do this, and here's why we don't want to do this. And that's how you start to build the trust, is explaining the decisions that you're making, how it impacts them, why it impacts them, and really showing your value as a partner.
Do you get pushback on that?
Not generally, but it is a long-term process. I think it's something that you can't expect to, I was going to say build Rome, but considering you just went to Greece, build Athens in a day. But it takes time, and it does, and it doesn't always work. And sometimes you just kind of go to the more cookie cutter, which is, like I said, always going to be needed on certain cases, but it is a longer term process. And it's longer term because it takes a while to learn the personalities, learn the culture of the corporation, learn how they function as well, and try and match yourself to that so that you can add the most value.
So to use probably some overused phrases, but they still have value associated with them. What, if I'm hearing correctly, part of what you're seeing, at least with the more mature corporate legal departments, mature when it comes to eDiscovery, is the beginnings of a migration away from a much more transactional approach. We have a case. We want you to do this on the case. Follow our instructions. Do it. Don't ask questions. So that's an extreme example. To something that really is a partnership. And I know we use the term partnership a lot and use it too much, but something where you are working together over time. They are learning better what you're capable of doing. You are learning better what they can and can't do, the challenges they face, and how to work all of that together for a long-term relationship, if you will. Is that what you're saying? Yes, I say that a lot. I believe so. I think a lot of corporations are, looking for that, because I do think that, again, it's a little bit of a hurdle to get to sometimes to get the buy-in. But I think once they see how much value there is in having that long-term partnership, it ends up paying,
dividends, because you can consistently go to someone who knows your portfolio, knows the ins and outs of everything that you're doing, and talk through and say, hey, this is what's coming up. How do we deal with this? It also, I think if I were a corporation, which I've never been, but I would also think that makes my life easier. So I'm not reinventing the wheel every time with a new person or a new provider, trying to be like, okay, this is what we want to do. You've built that relationship that, they trust you, you trust them, and the backstory, the other factors that are going into these decisions.
Well, you aren't at a corporation in that role and haven't been,
Yeah.
but you've worked with a number of corporate legal departments. What have you seen in terms of the change in their objectives when it comes to eDiscovery, what they care about and what they need delivered?
They, of course, always care about getting the right, productions out on time, all of the big things on time. But I think, again, what we're seeing more and more of is a concern, not a concern, but what is going out and how their data is managed. So before, we thought about processing, review out the door. Obviously, privilege was always a concern, but I think there's more and more looking at what are we actually getting out the door? Do we need to get this out the door? Can this go out the door? Have we looked for everything that's either privacy related, and not just from a personal privacy perspective, but a business perspective? Am I giving more than I need to? Does this open us up to more litigation? Those kind of things I think are more consistent. And also looking for consistency across their portfolio in things like privilege. Did I withhold this in another matter for privilege? Should I withhold it here? How can I do those checks? Or creating that portfolio consistency, because then, the more you're able to create that, the more the corporation kind of has a handle on their discovery business as a whole, and it's much more predictable about what's actually, coming in and going out.
So if I had been trying to, and I wasn't, but on all the various things you just listed, and put them down as a list of things you've got to check off and make sure are done, manage the status of, all of that. Sounds like a lot to take care of. Sounds like a lot of communication that needs to be done effectively. How do you manage that part?
It is a lot. And I think it's, transitioning from, where before I did manage review, and here, we focus on the eDiscovery side. It is, beneficial to have people that work on separate parts of those so that you can help each other manage all of those things. But you set communication protocols early on with the corporation. Everything needs to be tracked because it is a lot to handle. And then, there has audit trails through, communications, consistent communications with the client on here's where we are, here's the next steps, here's when we plan to deliver this, here's the considerations that we need to do there. Again, it's really a lot from our side of that proactive planning, working with everyone, setting the expectations of what needs to be done then. And again, that goes to setting the expectations for the corporation or your client that we need to have this done by X, to ensure that we are able to do all of these things effectively. Please don't tell us 3 hours before the production, because that's just not going to give enough time to properly do these things. So it is, a lot of communication. And I think that's reflected by, the amount of email that we're collecting. We're just talking all the time. So it is, that is one of the biggest challenges.
So eDiscovery for a lawsuit is but one set of activities in a much larger array of things that the in-house and outside attorneys and the people working for them need to accomplish. Because the life cycle of a matter starts often before there's ever a complaint filed and continues on to the final disposition of the matter, whatever that looks like. How involved are you all with components that go beyond the, if you will, the traditional confines of electronic discovery?
I would say, right now, not tangibly involved, but I think it is something, an area that more and more we're bringing into our conversations of consideration. Again, looking at that holistic view of the corporation and their players and what's going to, what information they're sharing us and how we can use that to kind of work with them potentially as we deliver our business, and how we might be able to help in those kind of situations. So I would say it's, we're not acting on it yet, but it is something that's the conversations are increasing.
So I'm curious, do you, it sounds like you don't, but I'm just curious about it. Do you end up working not only with eDiscovery platforms, but with matter management platforms as well? Or is that not really something you touch on?
Not at this time, no. So.
Yeah, I mean, I just put on my litigator hat from when I was doing that, and we had to do a lot of stuff that wasn't discovery.
Yeah, but I think that lends to, it is something that, when I'm participating in industry discussions and just go out, it is something I think you hear about more now than maybe you did 5 years ago. I think, matter management or, legal operations was very often somewhat separate from discovery. And I don't think that that's the case anymore. Or at least it's kind of merging, again, for that, how valuable the data has always been for corporations, but how, truly with privacy and other things, they want to have ownership of it. And that entire life cycle, I think, is being taken in a slightly different perspective.
The eDiscovery industry continues to grow. People continue to come into this industry or want to come into this industry. You've probably gotten questions that are some variation of, how can I do what you do? First, have you gotten questions like that?
Actually, no.
No. Well, if you were to get questions like that, what sort of advice would you give?
I think that the best advice I would give is, first build your foundation. So, when I graduated law school, I had a job, but I didn't pass the bar. So I started doing document review. I eventually passed the bar, but, the jobs didn't work out. So I started, continued doing doc review, worked my way up to a project manager, and have continued to kind of increase my skill set from there. So I think that the most valuable lesson I could give to someone who would say, do what I do is learn how to work in databases, learn how to understand how the documents move through them, because that's going to better set you up to be able to have those communications, to understand exactly what it's doing. And equally as important, understand how what we do as a service provider sits in the overall legal landscape. How does it, when it says, we're running search terms for a case, what does that mean? There's an attorney going to meet with someone else about those search terms. The documents produced are going to another side. Just making sure that you actually understand that it's just not a task in the database, but it leads into a whole larger structure that has very real world implications in terms of kind of what those are. And once you kind of build those out, then you can continue to do the fun stuff, learn how to solve problems, work with your clients. So that would be my biggest advice is, start from the ground up.
So returning to where we started and the people side of what we do, any final thoughts for folks in the audience on that?
I think just, I think we're in a really interesting time of the industry. I think the last 2 or 3 years have really had one of the biggest shifts that we've seen in discovery. And there's a lot of opportunities for service providers and corporations to, be creative, for lack of a better word, be curious. There's so many new approaches, new technologies, new data types that it's, you just get to solve problems one after the other. And I think that for me is a lot more interesting. So, you take those opportunities to talk to people, because I think that's how, you find the solutions, is just through talking them out.
Well, Lauren, thank you very much for spending time with us today. Lauren Roso is a solutions advisor at the eDiscovery provider ProSearch. This has been eDiscovery Leaders Live. I am George Socha from Reveal. Please join us again next Friday. Thanks, Lauren.
Thank you.